What's up guys, Lifting here. This is a video template, I guess you could say, for the character that I am playing right now, which is a Lacerate Juggernaut. This is my league starter, and it's currently, with the gameplay you're seeing, it's on some pretty budget gear, and it's only level 86, I think, so it should improve quite a lot from what you see here, but so far it's been pretty good for everything that I have tried yet. And what I'm doing currently with it is that I'm doing Uberlap farming, and it feels safe and it feels fast. And what I wanted to do here was to create a lab farmer that didn't compromise like map farming speed, because I wanted something that was good for the temple and for, well, mapping in general too. And since Lacerate then was buffed in the recent patch, then that just kind of coincided with that, and I chose to go with that. And Lacerate, the big difference is that Lacerate no longer has the minus 25% less attack speed. That has been removed, so you're not slower now that when you use Lacerate. And secondly, instead of getting up to +5 radius, then it now gets up to a whopping +9 radius, which is like in a crazy large area of effect increase. But to be fair, it also kind of needs that. I went into this with the goal of trying out. I'm sorry if you guys can hear some traffic in the background. It's super hot here in Denmark, so I need to have the windows open. But anyway, I went into this build here wanting to try and level with Lacerate, and I wasn't entirely sure if that was going to work well, because the way Lacerate starts is that it has no radius from the get-go, and then as you level up all the way up to 20, you eventually reach +9, and you get it like in between every other level. And they've made it so that I think it's the 2 first levels you don't get any radius. But if you then eventually get yourself a level 21, I think you can get it up to +10 radius. I'm a little unsure on that, but I think that's the point of it. So that means there's a reason to corrupt the Lacerate too. But anyway, you get it at level 12, and in my opinion that's too early for Lacerate, because the skill, in my opinion, just sucks early on. Like, since you have no radius on it, it feels super janky, and it like when you compare it to the other skills that you have available, like Cleave or Sunder, then it's just not really worth using at that point. So instead, after having played around with it a bit, I decided to just keep leveling with Sunder, and I did that all the way until level 50, I think. And then I swapped over to Lacerate. And at that time, I also had picked up the area of effect notes over here. And I think that was it. I only had this here. And I believe at that point, Lacerate had +5 approximately to radius. Optimally, I think you would want to get it to +7 before it starts to feel really good. And it's also a huge deal when you eventually get unyielding, because you get 5% increased area of effect for each endurance charge. And since we're Jug, and since we are an Uberlap farmer, we have a ton of endurance charges. We end up at 7 currently, and I'm planning on getting 8. So what I'm trying to say here is that until you get a decent amount of area of effect scaling on Lacerate and have some base radius to go by on the level of Lacerate itself, then you're better off using Sunder. Once you get to start using Lacerate, you'll get if you switch from Sunder, that is, you'll have a better single target, and you will eventually have a much better area of effect increase. What you see in the gameplay is me running around with just the unyielding buff from the Juggernauts, and then the area of effect notes I showed you before by the Templar. But I am not using the increased area of effect skill gem, and I could pick up more area of effect if I wanted to, but I really don't feel like I need to. So when making an Uberlap farmer, the absolute #1 thing you want to do if you want to do Uberlap farming is that you need to get a character to a point where you can no longer get one-shots at least against most of the mechanics. If you have like a super nasty lab that day with like essences and conduits at the same time, then you will either have to pump a lot of currency into it to be completely safe against that, or just decide on skipping the lab for that day, or skipping that phase, one of them. But that's why the Juggernaut is a great choice here. It's not too good at mitigating the elemental damage. It does a bit of that, but it is insanely good at mitigating physical damage. And that trivializes a lot of the Isaro buffs. And if you can then get your character to around 6,000 life, and you know how to deal with Isaro on like a, what should we say, decent skill level, experience level, then it becomes a very, very easy fight, and lab farming just becomes so much more enjoyable. And so let's quickly take a look at the Juggernaut Ascendancy here, and I'll explain why we pick it. First of all, we are using Kondo's Pride as a weapon, right? A two-hander. And secondly, we're not using Resolute Technique. That means that we need to have enough accuracy in order to be able to have a reliable hit chance. And right now I have with Lacerate a 94% chance to hit. So that's pretty good, right? The way we achieve this is via this Ascendancy, undeniable. It gives us 1,000 plus to accuracy rating. The nice thing is that it's a huge flat amount that makes your percent scale nodes in the skill tree much more efficient. For instance, a node like Precision up here, which gives 20% increased global accuracy, and this one here, these scale so much more effectively when you have a flat amount to scale it off, right? Makes good sense. And then the more accuracy we have, the more attack speed we also get. We get 30% more accuracy if we've dealt a critical strike chance. That's why it's nice to not have a Resolute Technique, and we get increased damage if we've dealt a critical strike in the past 8 seconds or something like that. And then based on our strength, we get a huge amount of accuracy, an equal amount actually. So that's why we don't want to have Resolute Technique, and that's why Kondo's Pride is actually a really, really nice weapon for this here. If I could just open my character inventory. Because if we take a look at Kondo's Pride, first of all, Kondo's Pride actually had a pretty nice amount of damage. It's a 456 DPS weapon with the current roll that I have right now, which is pretty good for 1 Chaos, right? But what it does really well is that we also get Leech, we get increased melee damage against bleeding enemies, and we apply bleed very effectively with this build. We cannot leech from critical strikes, so there will be some occasional hits where we're not leeching. It's no big deal because we have a low crit chance, but we still have a high enough crit chance so that the 30% chance to blind enemies on critical strike applies fairly reliably against bosses. And blind by itself is a huge defensive modifier you can add to your build, making you feel much tankier. Anyone who's been using a Stepknight Flask before knows how much that does against certain boss fights. Then we're using Unflinching. This makes it so that there's a chance that when we take damage we gain an endurance charge, and there's 25% chance that our endurance charges will go from, you know, whatever number it is, if it's 0 or if it's 4 or whatever you have at the time, to max. This makes it very reliable, and it's a huge defense where you can pretty much rely on that being your endurance charge generation. I do personally have an enduring cry for those situations where I want to be absolutely sure that I can get my endurance charges up before a certain fight. But it's not really necessary. But for Uberlab farming, I recommend it. For instance, you can cast the enduring cry on the traps, so you can get your endurance charges up before fighting Isaro in the final fight, for instance. And then it gives +1 to maximum endurance charges. That's why I have 7 now instead of 6. With Unyielding, we get 5% increased damage per endurance charge and 5% increased area of effect per endurance charge. When I eventually get my 8th endurance charge, then this means it will be a 40% increased damage and 40% increased area of effect, and that's very significant. You definitely notice this here too, if you've picked up your endurance charges before picking it up on the area of effect on the Lacerate. Finally, I also picked up Unbreakable, 2% life regen. Life regen is amazing in lab. One thing, or one of the most important stats in the lab, if you want it to feel less cumbersome and don't really, or if you just want it to feel good, let's put it that way, then you want fizz mitigation and you want life regen, because that by itself completely screws over the traps. And you pretty much get that here. We get reduced damage taken too, 5% reduced, and that goes for the elemental damage too, and chaos damage, etc. Armor is doubled from body armor. Doesn't matter too much, it's nice, but yeah. And then you have the 1.5 of total physical damage prevented from hits in the past 10 seconds is regenerated as life per second. This basically means that the more damage you've taken in this time of 10 seconds here, the more you're gonna get of a life regen on top of what you already have. And this can also be really nice if you are running through traps, as they have some high spikes of damage, which increases your life regen, and it makes it even easier to run through the traps. It's not really necessary though, and I mostly have this here for the 5% reduced damage taken. That's the most important. Then the life regen is nice, and the other thing not so much, but still it's a good bonus. You could alternatively, and I might do that later, go for Unstoppable. You get the movement speed, and that's not too important for us, but the cannot be stunned and cannot be slowed below base speed is very nice. It prevents your attacks from being interrupted, and you cannot get frozen and all that stuff. That saves you a flask roll and yeah, so forth. So, I don't know. I haven't fully decided on that, but for now at least, Unbreakable is super nice. I also recommend that you get yourself the Hemophilia Gloves. I was a bit torn about these gloves because they do give you some more damage, like 36% increased attack damage against bleeding enemies. That's pretty decent. And they give you a bit extra damage over time. And the bleed we have in this build is enough that it makes a difference, but it's not really enough that you want to try and scale it. It's not really worth that, in my opinion. But the absolute most important thing about this here is that bleeding enemies you kill explode, dealing 5% of their maximum life as physical damage. And this makes an absolute huge difference for this build here, because it greatly increases your clear speed, because it kills off the stragglers, and it also makes you much safer because it makes these huge packs of monsters explode before they are able to deal attacks or do attacks themselves, right? I tried it with and without, because there's definitely better gloves, but this by itself here really makes it worth it. I highly recommend you use those, and they're pretty cheap too. We're also using the Belt of the Deceiver, and the important thing here is that nearby enemies are intimidated. This is a very big damage modifier. You deal a ton more damage with this. And also you take 30% reduced extra damage from critical strikes, making you safer. This is the thing that can sometimes make the difference between a crit that kills you in the lab versus one where you barely survive, but then you have enough time to recuperate. I'm using the Blood Grip Amulet. I love this thing for labbing. It's super cheap. It gives you a lot of life regen because it's a marble amulet. It gives you flat fist to scale life. Some flat life regen doesn't matter too much. 100% increased life recovery from flasks is actually pretty powerful. It basically doubles it, right? And then moving while bleeding doesn't cause you to take extra damage. This is one of the things that makes traps really dangerous in the lab sometimes, especially the ones that are bugged that applies double damage bleed. But let's not go into that. It's when you get hit by some of those traps and then you move and then you take a ton of damage, because bleed deals more damage when you're moving, right? This prevents it. You still want to have something that removes bleed, like a Staunching Flask, but yeah, this is so nice for labbing. I use Draconia set just for the dex, which is first of all a little hard to cap unless you spend some points in the skill tree or get it on your gear. So we save that there. We get attack speed, we get some, and we get a ton of life, flat life. Draconia is pretty badass for this, actually. I use a Belly of the Beast because we get a decent amount of flat life in our setup, and it's just an overall nice chest for a lot of extra life. And then the Lion's Raw Flask, which gives us a ton more damage when activated. It's also the one that allows us to push Argus away when we attack him, making him very, very easy to deal with. And as for the skill tree, I started up here as the Marauder, obviously. And I will be respecking this here. I'll be going down this route instead, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet. I've tested out a few different setups, but I like that the better. So ignore that. But what I suggest if you start doing this is to level with a two-hander as soon as you get Butchery. You want to go down here and then into Butchery. And then you want to start using two-handers. And I suggest using those very cheap leveling unique two-handers. I think Limb Split is the first one you can get. It requires level 13 though, so keep that in mind. Until then, you can dual wield two weapons, two axes or whatever, and then you just use Cleave or Ground Slam or whatever you want until you get Butchery. And at level 12, you swap over to Sunder, and then you use Sunder all the way up to whenever you feel like Lacerate feels good to swap over to. But I'd say around level 50, but maybe more optimally around 60 or even higher. It's up to you. But grab Butchery real quick, and then it's pretty much, if we are to say that you would go in this direction, then you would go up here, and you would have to move all the way down here, and then move into this. And I would probably advise you to try and see if you could level with the unique two-hand swords, because then you can make use of the Razor's Edge and Blade Master nodes here, because otherwise you will for a long time not really have any nodes that scale damage, and it's gonna feel a little slow and it's a little sluggish. Alternatively, you can also do what I just did here, and then go this way and quickly get into this and into this and then this down here. Then you will have that issue solved, but you will then have to respec them later and go down here to save some points and be a little more efficient. Grab the this here after you've gotten the damage nodes down here, and of course pick up life as needed as you go throughout the leveling process. Of course, also make sure to get flat life on all your rare gear. Without that, you can't scale your life from your skill tree, and it makes it very inefficient. So get flat life on your gear. And I think that's it for the skill tree. It can be a little hard to get enough intelligence and enough dexterity, so you will maybe have to pick these up or some of the other nodes you see fit as you level, and then spec out of them later. It can be the same for resistances. You may want to pick up Diamond Skin to fix your resist and such. Also jewels, get some resist on that. I think that's for the skill tree. I'll of course leave a link to the path of building for my current character below, but with the fixed skill tree. Also, let's quickly talk about gems. It's not too advanced, but basically I have my Lacerate in my main setup. It's a 5-link right now. And then I have Concentrated Effect. This is when I do overlapping. This is nice because you actually want to have less area of effect when you're fighting Isaro, because otherwise you have a tendency, because it has a huge area of effect, to kill like the gargoyles or the dudes that walk around, the skeleton guys. Brutality, melee physical damage, and then multi-strike. And that's another point to make, like Lacerate really doesn't feel good until you have multi-strike. So I really don't advise that you at least start before you can get multi-strike. That should be the absolute earliest. Then in my second one, I am using Ancestral Protector, Brutality, Melee Fist, and Bloodlust. And Bloodlust is nice because we are applying a bleed over here with the Lacerate setup. I'll get this to be a 5 or 6 link eventually too, and this here will of course turn into a 6 link too, unless I die before that, of course. Then I'm using Enduring Cry. You don't have to, but I like that to get my endurance charges up in case I know there's something tough coming up. I'm using it with increased duration, so the heal effect from it lasts longer, and the same for Blood Rage here. And then I'm using it, the Haste Aura, because I can't really use any of the damage dealing elemental auras. So haste is what we have here, and it's nice. It gives us more attack speed, and attack speed is one of those things that you really want to try and get as much as possible. Try and get as much you can on your duels too, because you are leaping around with this, and you can weapon swap over to the bright beak and such, but it's nice if you can have a decent amount of attack speed just while doing it with the Kondo Sprite, which in itself is a rather slow weapon. I did something when I was just mapping and doing Temple where I would use Double Strike instead of my Ancestral Protector over here. You could use that. And that was pretty good for when you encountered single targets for that type of content. It's not good for overlap mapping or overlap farming, because you can't rely on having the souls ready and your Vault skill filled up for that encounter. Also, you wouldn't be able to control them properly, and they would kill stuff they're not supposed to and so forth. I'm then using Leap Slam as movement skill, faster attacks, Blood Magic, because otherwise I can't sustain it mana-wise. If I get to the point where I can sustain it mana-wise, then I'll add in a quality Culling Strike here for even more attack speed and call. And Fortify, of course. Then finally, Summon Lightning Golem on cast when damage taken, so I don't have to cast it myself. I'm too lazy for that. You can also use the Stone Golem if you want. That's okay too if you want more life regen. And Vulnerability Blasphemy to increase the damage we deal and the bleed effect. And that's pretty much it. I wanted this to be a short video. That turns out that's not really the case, but hopefully this gave you a good introduction to the build. Once I get the build a little further, some higher levels and some better gear, better links, etc., then I will be uploading a gameplay video where we test it out against the various bosses and whatever content that feels relevant at the time. And if there's a lot of changes, I may make a new video, a new build guide video, one of like the big ones that I typically do. But even if I don't and I still like the build, I will be making a forum build guide for you guys to follow, so you have all the information and in details and such. If there's any questions, feel free to ask me. Thank you for watching, and bros, do you even nerd?